the young, and the restless spoiler's shock. Noah had never intended to feel trapped by the town that was supposed to be his home. Yet the longer he stayed in Genoa City, the more it felt like a stage built for someone else's story, with him awkwardly wedged into a role that didn't quite fit. He could sense it in the way people looked at him, with a mixture of expectation and mild disappointment, as if his every move were being measured against a script only they could see. In another life, far from the legacy of the Newman name, he might have been just an artist in a small city, someone allowed to be quiet and complicated without needing to be constantly compelling. But here, in a place where his family's history was practically carved into the walls, Noah was always Noah Newman first and himself second. And that title carried a weight he could feel grinding down the softer parts of him. It was as if invisible producers, both literal and metaphorical, had decided he should become a major player, someone important, someone central to the unfolding drama of Genoa City. Decisions were made around him as though he were destined to be at the core of everything. But there was a strange emptiness in the way people responded. The audience out there, the neighbors, the viewers, the gossipers. The people who followed every ripple in Newman history known of them seemed to truly embrace him. They watched, they judged, they commented, but they didn't warm to him. Noah felt that chill every day, in every half-hearted hello, in every conversation that died a little too quickly, in every moment where he saw interest slide off his face like rain on glass. It was almost as if life itself had decided to write him into prominence on paper. Yet the world refused to quite believe it. And that mismatch between how central he was supposed to be and how peripheral he actually felt was slowly tearing him apart. Sienna saw all of this with a clarity that was as unsettling as it was intimate. Where Noah struggled to articulate the pressure gnawing at him, she could read it in the tension in his shoulders, in the way his smile always hovered a little too close to vanishing, in the way his eyes drifted away whenever someone mentioned his family name. To her, Genoa City was not a home, but a polished cage, a place where everyone wore carefully chosen expressions, and every casual conversation felt like reconnaissance. She had not grown up wrapped in the mythology of this town like Noah had, so she had no nostalgia softening the edges. Instead, she saw Genoa City as a network of invisible chains, obligations, expectations, and unspoken rules about who belonged and how they were supposed to behave. Every time she walked down its streets, Sienna could feel herself being weighed and measured, cataloged and put in a box she had no intention of staying in. She did not want a life in this town, not a real one. A brief performance, maybe, but not roots. The more she watched Noah try to contort himself into someone his family and the town might finally approve of, the more she felt anger building inside her, and it just at Genoa City. But at the part of him that still felt obligated to endure it, her frustration turned slowly into pressure. At first, her suggestions were almost gentle. What if they went somewhere else? What if they started over in a city where no one cared about his last name? Where his art could define him more than his bloodline did? What if they could walk into a room and not feel the weight of all the stories that came before them? Noah would half listen, half smile, saying he understood that maybe someday they would. But his feet stayed rooted here, tangled in family loyalty and the vague hope that things might get better if he just tried a little harder. That half-hearted hope felt like an insult to Sienna's instincts, so the tone of her urging shifted. Her voice sharpened, her arguments hardened. She reminded him of every time he'd come home exhausted, because yet another attempt to fit into Genoa City's expectations had gone wrong. She replayed his own complaints back to him, framing them as undeniable proof this town was suffocating him, and his refusal to leave was slowly becoming a form of self-sabotage. She made it sound like the only rational option was escape, and she repeated it often enough that the word leave started to echo in Noah's mind, even when she wasn't there. But if Noah believed leaving was about saving himself, for Sienna, it was about something much more complicated and much darker. She did want him out of Genoa City, yes, but she also wanted herself to vanish from this town, from these people, from their eyes and their narratives and their assumptions. Disappearing was not just a fantasy for her, it was a strategy. Sienna had lived too many lives already to pretend that this one was clean. Long before Genoa City and its polished lies, there had been another stage, another series of performances, and sharing that stage had been Matt. He was not just a name from her past. He was the person who had once pulled her into a world where survival and manipulation lived side by side, where necessity often justified ruthlessness. Together, they had orchestrated small cons and carefully tailored dramas, always staying one step ahead of people who underestimated them. There had been nights when she was the one wrapping his bleeding hands, mornings when they fled a town before sunrise, afternoons spent planning how to steer someone else's greed or desire in just the right direction. Matt had seen her at her most brilliant and her most monstrous, and he never flinched. To him, Sienna was not a victim of circumstances. She was a weapon, a strategist, a player. When she walked away from that life and drifted into Noah's orbit, she told herself that everything with Mataviri's scheme, every wound, every whispered plan in the dark belling to a past she had shed. Yet there was a part of her that never stopped thinking like that person. The part that scanned every room for angles and exits. The part that looked at Genoa City and saw not a community, but a collection of vulnerabilities, waiting to be exploited. Matt had never completely disappeared. He lingered at the margins of her new life like a shadow she could not quite shake. At first, the contact was sporadic, almost harmless, a stray text, a missed call. An email that simply said, "You okay?" She would ignore it for weeks, then finally respond with something short and vague. But over time, the messages became more pointed, hints about things going wrong in places they had once passed, through cracks in old arrangements, opportunities that might be seized by someone willing to get their hands dirty. Whenever she let the conversation go further than a single reply, Sienna could feel that familiar switch flipping in her head, turning ordinary life back into a series of moves on a board. Matt understood her at that level in a way Noah never could. When she admitted to him, in a moment of unguarded honesty, that Genoa City made her feel watched and hemmed in, that she was starting to dream about disappearing entirely. He didn't lecture her about starting fresh or doing the right thing. He simply asked what kind of exit she wanted to stage. Did she want people to think she had broken down, run away, betrayed someone, been hurt, vanished without a trace? To Matt, this was a creative conversation, not a moral one. And that alone made it easier for Sienna to lean into. Slowly, their back and forth evolved into something more dangerous. They were no longer just reminiscing about the old days, but drafting a narrative for the future. A plan in which Sienna wouldn't just leave Genoa City. She would be written out of it in a way that served her purposes. Maybe she'd be gone in shame, maybe in fear, maybe in mystery, but gone, undeniably, irrevocably. Impossible to call back into the story. While Noah wrestled with his inability to meet the expectations that clung to him from his family, from the town, from some invisible audience that never quite applauded Sienna and Matt, were quietly building a script that could solve several problems at once. If Sienna disappeared under the right circumstances, the town would turn its eyes away from her, busy arguing over what had happened. Noah would be forced to confront a brutal break, instead of clinging to blurred dreams of a life with her in Genoa City. And in the chaos, she would be free to move forward with whatever scheme she and Matt were shaping, beyond the reach of Newman drama and the suffocating gaze of Genoa City. On the surface, she remained the concerned girlfriend, pushing Noah to leave, tapping into his frustration and pain and using them as leverage. Underneath, she was also the co-author of a far more intricate play, one that involved timing, secrecy, and dangerous allies. Every time Noah admitted he felt out of place, she stored the words like ammunition. Every time he said he didn't think the town wanted him, she mentally underlined the lines. She might have been genuinely angry on his behalf, but she was also folding the anger into the architecture of a plan. The more unstable his life here felt, the easier it would be for him to accept the way things fell apart later. Claire was not supposed to be part of that plan, yet she had a way of drifting near the edges of other people's stories, picking up on currents they assumed were hidden. She had watched Noah's quiet struggle from a distance, knowing just enough about his history to recognize how heavy the Newman name could be. In the past, there had been flashes of warmth between Thea's shared joke, a conversation that went a little deeper than the weather, but whatever they might have become was quickly swallowed by the tides of his family's dramas and the arrival of Sienna. Still, Claire noticed things. She noticed that Noah laughed less than he used to. She noticed the way he looked at the ground when people asked him how he was doing, and answered with vague phrases like "I'm working on it." She noticed the way Sienna seemed to be both an anchor and a storm around him, steadying him on some days and leaving him visibly shaken on others. Claire did not hate Sienna, but she did not trust her either. There was a cold calculation behind Sienna's eyes at certain moments, a flicker that did not align with the image of a woman simply overwhelmed by the pressures of a difficult town. Genoa City had taught Claire many things over the years, and one of the lessons that stuck was this: people who looked like they were running from something usually were. On a night that might have been like any other, if not for what she was about to see, Claire found herself walking through the park with no clear destination in mind. She often did this when the air inside her own head felt too thick, when the swirl of other people's problems, Noah's exhaustion, Sienna's tension, the quiet rumbling changes in town would not settle. The park at night was a strange in-between place, half lit by street lamps that cast long shadows across the paths, making every tree and bench look like it belonged to some secret waiting to be uncovered. The air was colder than she expected, dry and still, the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel amplified. Her footsteps crunched faintly over gravel and dried leaves, and she tucked her hands deeper into her coat pockets, breathing slowly as she let her mind wander. She might have turned back early, if not for the flicker of movement and the distancia shift of shadows near one of the benches, partly hidden by a cluster of shrubs. Something about that movement was enough to hold her attention. She slowed, eyes narrowing, telling herself she was just being curious, that it was probably nothing. Yet the longer she looked, the more clearly she saw the outline of two figures in the dim light. One stood, tense and close, while the other sat with a hunched posture that suggested pain or exhaustion. As Claire moved closer, staying instinctively near the edges of the path and the cover of trees, the details sharpened. She could see now that the standing figure was a woman, and there was something very familiar in the tilt of her head, in the way her hair fell over one shoulder, in the economy of her gestures. The sitting figure wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up so low it almost swallowed his face. But the way his shoulders moved, the way his hand occasionally lifted to touch his side, told her he was injured. The woman reached into a bag and pulled something out, a strip of fabric, a roll of bandage. She couldn't be sure from this distance and began tending to his arm with practiced precision. The angle of her face caught the light, and in that moment the recognition hit. It was Sienna. Her heart gave a sharp, unpleasant thud against her ribs. Claire ducked instinctively behind a nearby tree, pressing herself into the shadow, peering around the bark in small increments to make sure she hadn't been seen. She watched as Sienna's hands moved over the man's arm, cleaning what looked like blood, wrapping it tightly with a calm efficiency that suggested this was not her first time doing something like this. The man in the hoodie shifted, and the lamplight briefly brushed his jawline, the line of his mouth, the shape of his nose beneath the shadow of the hood. It was only a moment, but sometimes a moment is all it takes for memory to snap into place. Claire had heard the name Matt whispered before, attached to rumors and half-told stories that seemed to trail after Sienna's arrival, like a faint smell of smoke after a fire. She had seen one or two blurred photos in the past, images that were supposed to be of him, passed along in conversations that always ended with someone saying it was better not to get involved. She remembered the angular jaw, the way he seemed to smirk even when he was not quite smiling, the restless energy in his posture. When the hooded man lifted his head just enough for the light to carve out his features, Claire felt the breath catch in her throat. She didn't need a second look. It was Matt. The realization rolled through her like cold water. Sienna was in the park in the middle of the night, tending to the wounds of a man like that. Not in a hospital, not in a public place where help might be easily found, but here, in the shadows, as if secrecy mattered more than safety. Whatever story Sienna had been selling about wanting to leave Genoa City, because the town was too much for her, suddenly felt incomplete. This was not a woman cornered by an oppressive place. This was a woman actively colluding with someone dangerous. Someone who did not belong in the clean version of her life she had presented to Noah. A dozen thoughts crashed in Claire's mind all at once. She thought of Noah, tired and uncertain, clinging to the idea that maybe if he tried a little longer, he could make this place and this relationship work. She thought of the slightly desperate way Sienna had been pushing him to leave, of the growing intensity in her voice when she talked about starting over somewhere far away. She thought of all the little inconsistency-ish nights Sienna claimed to be too overwhelmed to talk, the unexplained absences, the distracted looks that flashed across her face when she thought no one was watching. Suddenly, it all felt less like the behavior of someone struggling and more like the behavior of someone juggling too many secrets at once. Claire's fingers closed around her phone almost before she registered the decision. In Genoa City, she had learned that words alone rarely carried enough weight. People lied, memories blurred, and stories could be twisted. Proof mattered. Evidence mattered. She did not know yet what she would do with it, but she knew she needed it. With slow, measured movements, Claire pulled her phone from her pocket and lowered the volume all the way down, her thumb shaking slightly as she opened the camera. She switched off the flash, knowing even a brief burst of harsh white light would give her away instantly. The screen cast a faint glow over her face as she raised the phone, angling it between the branches to get a clear view of the two figures. Sienna had now stepped closer to the mammoth. She reminded herself. That's Matt, their face bent toward his, as if listening intently. From Claire's vantage point, it almost looked tender. But there was a tension in the line of Sienna's shoulders that suggested this was not just about affection. It was about strategy, about control, about two people locked in a conspiracy that had nothing to do with healing. The bandage was in place now, wrapped tight around his arm. Sienna's fingers lingered for a second near the knot, her brows furrowed. Matt turned his head slightly, saying something that never reached Claire's ears. And his face shifted into view again, clearer this time. That was the moment. Claire took a breath, steadied her hand, and pressed the shutter. The faint click of the camera sounded absurdly loud in the near silence, at least to her own ears. Her heart leapt into her throat as she immediately lowered the phone and held her breath, straining to see if either of them had reacted. But Sienna did not whirl around, and Matt did not spring to his feet. Whatever noise the phone had made was swallowed by the distance and the night. Claire risked a quick glance at the photo she had captured. It was a little grainy in the low light, but it was unmistakable. Sienna, her face partly in profile, standing close to a hooded man whose features were just clear enough to identify. The bandage visible around his arm, the park bench, and the lonely lamppost framing them both. In that frozen moment, the image told a story no one could easily talk their way out of. It showed Sienna not as the overwhelmed outsider struggling to adjust to Genoa City, but as an active partner in something secretive and possibly dangerous. It showed Matt in the one place he was not supposed to be, right here, back in the middle of her life. As she backed away, careful to keep her footsteps quiet and her silhouette hidden by the trees, Claire felt the weight of the photo in her phone like a stone in her pocket. She did not know what Sienna and Matt were planning, but she knew now, with a certainty that made her hands cold, that it involved deception and risk and the deliberate manipulation of perception. Sienna's desire to disappear from everyone's sight no longer sounded like the dream of a woman, crushed by social pressure. It sounded like the carefully constructed endgame of someone who wanted to rewrite her place. In this story entirely, someone willing to stage her own exit so that whatever she did next would happen out of reach and out of sight. Noah, caught somewhere between the expectations of his family, the indifference of the town, and the emotional gravity of Sienna's demands, had no idea he was standing on the edge of a trapdoor that might open beneath him at any moment. Claire, clutching her phone on the walk home, felt the sickening knowledge that she now held something that could alter that trajectory up, saving him from the lie he was living, maybe shattering him in the process. The park receded behind her, swallowing up the figures of Sienna and Matt as if they had never been there at all. But the image on her screen said otherwise. Whether she was ready or not, Claire had stepped into their play, not as a scripted character, but as an unexpected variable. And in a world like Genoa City, where stories were everything and public perception could make or destroy a life, a single photograph had the power to flip the entire narrative on its head.